Right, today is December the 8th in 2022, and my guest is Eli Dourado. Eli is Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. Eli is also a blogger, investor, and self-described regulatory hacker. Today, we're going to have a conversation about many things: technology, innovation, and regulatory bottlenecks. Eli is certainly somewhat of a micro-celebrity among people like me who care about technological progress. His breadth of knowledge across many different fields is breathtaking. Unfortunately, we'll only get to talk about a few of them, depending on time, but the range of topics includes aviation, energy, housing, cryptocurrency, biotech, cybersecurity. He's a long-awaited and oft-requested guest. Eli, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me. This is going to be great.
For sure. Eli, besides what I said, what else would you like listeners to know about you?
So I'm an economist by training, right? So I got my PhD in economics, and what I really kind of think of myself as doing is just sort of taking a bit of a normative and applied perspective on economics, right? So what matters to me as an economist is economic growth, and I sort of see my career as trying to get economic growth moving again after the great stagnation. And so a lot of where that has taken me is sort of developing like sort of strongly held views about what the future could be like. Because I believe, we won't do anything if we don't have concrete views. So I think that it's very common among, libertarians and economists to sort of have a hands-off approach that, the market will just magically do a lot of good things. And I think there is some merit to that view, right? I think that there is a decentralized, invisible hand that coordinates human activity, but that only goes so far, and we can't just sort of sit back and say, oh, all we need to do is get government out of the way and everything will be fine. In fact, there's a lot of societal stasis that the government is responding to demand as well, right? And there is demand for a sort of a static world, and we have to overcome that. And part of that is knowing the future that we're going to build for.
Yeah, someone's got to do it, right?
Exactly.
Someone's got to build it. So you've also traversed between the private sector and now I believe a public university. So where or what in your career, where do you see kind of the big levers that you can pull to achieve technological progress through your work?
Yeah, I guess I've had different kinds of success in different points, right? So, I'd say my first success in technology policy was kind of before I made this shift to physical world technology. And when I was at the Mercator Center, I was on like a State Department delegation that helped like negotiate a international treaty on telecommunications. Basically, if you've heard the story of, the UN was trying to take over the internet, that was true. And I was there and, I helped stop it. Right. And so that was, I think the story that I tell about that is, it's kind of long and probably don't have time for it today, but it basically is like, I was just like sort of following, kept pulling on the string, the more, kind of got to a certain point and had a small success, and I just kept pulling the string and sort of got to the next stage and kept pulling the string.
I want to hear that story.
So I wrote it up for Ars Technica. It's really long, but if you look up if you search Ars Technica 2012 Eli Dourado, you can have my story of how I ended up negotiating an international treaty in Dubai. On where we basically saved the internet.
What's the synopsis? What was the were you able to prevent it?
Yeah, so my colleague Jerry Brito and I basically started leaking documents from this meeting, and we basically said, hey, here we didn't like hide behind pseudonyms or anything. We said these are our names. This website is not affiliated with our employer, but if you have documents related to this meeting and you would like us to host them, we will do it. And so, we sort of started getting documents posted online, sort of bringing sort of increased awareness about what was going on into these discussions that was not very transparent, and sort of bringing so had some success bringing awareness to it, and then sort of got had a little State Department outreach to us, as people who were concerned about this meeting, and sort of attended some meetings there when they kind of were like, well, we're starting to put together, an advisory committee for this, and then we're starting to put together a dissertation, a delegation for this. I was like, I raised my hand. I said, like, I'll participate, and got deeply involved in it, and just kept pulling the string until, like, I was in the meeting. I was like leaking, like, with the U.S. government's knowledge, was like leaking stuff with my official credentials, and including discussion drafts, some very nasty documents that were, by Middle Eastern and countries, and Russia and China and so on, and put those documents online. Really drew a lot of attention to it, and sort of it helped the negotiations. But in the end, what was interesting was that the authoritarian regimes, like, even after they caved on a few things, in the end they kind of went too far right at the last minute, and that gave the U.S. and Europe cover to just completely withdraw from the negotiations, which is what happened. So it was a really great success, because we watered down what was going to be agreed to in the first place, and then we didn't agree to it, which is like kind of it's like a 10 out of 10 in terms of like the results that we could have hoped for going in.
You played at your poll, so that's something that I've also encountered from my previous work. I was also trained as an economist. I was in DC in the policy world, afterwards in the private sector. It always seemed to me, in the private sector, you can build great companies, so that can achieve a big and lasting impact. And in the policy world, there are these rare moments when something big is happening, and then you should be prepared to be at the right place at the right time and say the right things, right?
Yeah. So the lesson, again, I take away from that is just don't stop. Like, I could have stopped after, like, we got a little media attention for the initial website, and I just kept going. So I think that's sort of the usual lesson I get when I tell that story. And then, I spent a few years at Boom, and there I think the lesson was just try a bunch of things, right? So I was the first policy hire at Boom, and we were dealing with at a time when FAA's stated policy was that, landing and takeoff noise for supersonic airplanes was going to have to be the same as for subsonic airplanes, which there's a whole bunch of physical reasons why that doesn't make sense, or that doesn't work well. And, basically I kind of came in there and without really like much of a strategy of what we were going to do. And we just had to try a bunch of things until we figured out what worked. And what ended up working was applying early for type cert, so that we came in under a deadline under international rules, and then sort of at the same time that we because we applied early, FAA kind of had to sit down and figure out what their rules were. And another thing that we'd been doing in parallel was sort of creating allies in Congress, and so FAA was like kind of aware that the Congress and the administration were paying attention to this issue. And so that kind of, I don't think it forced their hand or anything, but they kind of knew that this is something that the rest of the government wanted to see go well. And so that got us to the point where there was a legal memo sort of saying, okay, this is the new policy. Here's how we're going to handle, applicants for type cert, and especially on noise certification. So, or anywhere where firm rules don't already exist, yeah. Right? And so it was. I think that was just like we had to try a bunch of things. We didn't know which combination of the things that we were going to try was going to work, and so we just tried all of them until some combination of them worked, and so that would be like another.
Yeah,
piece
to
of
back up a
advice,
little.
yeah.
So Boom is a company that does supersonic flight. Right?
Jets. That's right. Mm-hmm.
And the obstacle was a policy around noise. So you're not allowed to go above a certain noise level. And
landing and takeoff noise specifically, not like sonic boom noise.
That basically prevented the development, or probably did for a long time, I think, I read your piece, of supersonic flight. And you, as working in public policy at Boom, you were able to achieve what? What's the status of supersonic flight right now?
The legal status of this is that the FAA's legal position is that if you are an applicant as a supersonic airliner, they will come up with, if no general rules exist, they will come up with specific rules that are tailored to the needs of your program to make sure that you can be.
That's interesting. It's like a flexible regulatory option.
It's flexible. I mean, it's flexible within the parameters set out by statute, which actually are, I think, pretty good, right? Sort of the statute says that you have to be economic. It has to be, the environmental rules especially have to be economically reasonable, technologically practicable, and appropriate for the aircraft design, right? While protecting the environment, which I think, that's all we all want or wanted all along. And that is a good paradigm, I think, that FAA has for that. So it worked out really well. But yeah, my sort of, I think that by being in that role, to get back to your original question, I think that, we had a lot of leverage, right? I think I had written a previous paper on supersonics at the Mercatus Center, and it got some attention within DOT and within FAA and so on. But then going in as the representative of a company that's like, we are actually trying to do this, that carries a little bit more weight sometimes. And so I think that is a valuable experience to have.
Right. We already went deep into a couple of examples of regulatory hacking. To take one step back, can you lay out the bigger picture, right? So why is economic growth important? What is total factor productivity? What is the great stagnation?
Yeah, so economic growth is important because it either directly leads to or correlates very strongly with everything we care about, right? So if you care about certainly your material situation, right? You care about economic productivity, right? Or GDP and total factor productivity, which I'll explain in a minute. But it also, I think there's a lot of people who say, well, economics isn't everything, right? What I care about is spending time with my grandchildren, or having a long and fulfilling life, right? Well, you're going to have more time to spend with your grandchildren if we have faster economic growth, because part of that means that we're going to have research and development into drugs that extend your lifespan and your health span, more importantly. So if you want to play soccer with your grandchildren, you might be able to do that better if we have growth going on now. So I think that, and I think also economic growth also, I think, correlates with political stability, right? Like none of us want to live through a time of deep political turbulence where society is falling apart and so on. I think that political stability is a function of everybody's life getting better at a sort of above average sort of rate, right? If expectations are met and exceeded in sort of the material world, I think that leads to social harmony. So that's another reason. So I think there's a bunch of direct there's a clear direct reason that economic growth is important, and there's a lot of indirect reasons. And so I would always be in favor of counting both the direct and the indirect, because I think that sometimes people caricature the need for faster growth. So what is total factor productivity? So obviously we can increase GDP a bunch of different ways, right? We can increase GDP by just simply growing the population, right? You have more workers, more laborers. We can grow GDP by, we all work longer hours. We take less vacation. We work nights and weekends and so on. We can increase GDP by, over some sort of medium term, we can increase GDP by just saving more, right? By not consuming the fruits of our labor and just plowing it right back into production, right? And so what total factor productivity does is it abstracts the growth that we really want from those sort of forms of growth, right? We can, obviously you can increase GDP by saving more or working longer hours, but that's not what we actually want. We want to consume, and we want to be have leisure time. And so what total factor productivity does is it estimates, how much output can you get for a fixed basket of inputs. So if holding sort of roughly constant the inputs that you have, how many dollars of GDP can you get out of it? And is that number going up over time or down over time? And so what happened historically in the US was that from about 1920 to the early 1970s, total factor productivity was growing at 2% per year, year after year, pretty consistently. And in the early 1970s, there was a change, and it started to grow more slowly. It was about like 1% or less, just under 1%, from sort of 1973 to about 1995. And then there was a brief period where it went back up to 2% a year, which was great. It was the sort of the roaring 90s, right? 1995 to 2005 or so. And then it basically flatlined. So we've had very, very stagnant growth in total factor productivity since about 2005. It's been about 0.3% per year. So just really devastating stagnation. And I should I should point out, of course, that these processes are exponential, right? So a change from 2% to 0.3% is a very, very big deal. Sort of compounded over a period of 10, 20, 30 years. That's like real change that is resulted from stagnation. And sort of my estimate is, if this had not happened, if the stagnation that began in the 1970s had not happened, Americans would have incomes that are about twice as high today, accounting for not only TFP, but also for the capital deepening and the capital accumulation that would be sure to happen. So about twice as high, everybody's income could be twice as high if we hadn't stagnated, which is just wild to think about.
So the question of all questions, WTF happened in 1971.
Yeah, so my answer for that is there's a court case called Calvert-Cliffs Coordinating Committee versus Atomic Energy Commission. And it was the first case interpreting a law called NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. And it basically indicated the courts were going to be very, very serious about enforcing NEPA in a particular way, which was they were going to make sure that basically nothing could happen until sort of environmental reviews had been thoroughly done, and all the NEPA implementing procedures were thoroughly followed and developed. So that's, I think,
that sounds a good thing, right? So it's environmental protection regulation,
sure.
Right? So what's the problem with it?
It's not environmental protection. It's an environmental policy that requires the government to document the environmental effects before they do something, while not imposing any sort of substantive protection. So basically, you could, in principle, say we are building this industrial plant. We're going to emit this much toxic goo. It's going to cause this many cases of cancer, etc. And at the end of that report, the government can still say, and we've decided to, greenlight this factory, let's say. So that is possible under NEPA. NEPA does not protect the environment substantively. What it does is it creates a process by which people have to have their voices heard, right? There's notice and comment periods. There's also an opportunity to sue under the Administrative Procedure Act after the report is done and the decision is made. You can sue on the basis of, some aspect of that NEPA report was not perfect, right? The government cut corners. They, were arbitrary and capricious in some element of that report. And if the court agrees, then they can send it back, and you've got to start over. So, or you got to, at least correct the report and again, probably put it through notice and comment and so on.
So that court case and what followed after it made it much harder to build anything, or nuclear power plants in general, for that matter, or what was the?
Yeah, so the Atomic Energy Commission actually had to stop all nuclear licensing for, I think, 18 months. So completely halted all of its work while it sort of developed its NEPA implementing procedures. That was the result, the direct result of that case. I think, obviously the case was only interpreting the Atomic Energy Commission's regulations, but it applied to the whole government, right? Like the sort of the idea that you have to have these regulations in place and then go through sort of this defined process. Anyway. So when people say 1971 was the turning point, that's always my point. And I don't think NEPA is responsible for 100% of the stagnation. To be clear,
it's more like 20%. But it specifically halted nuclear, and nuclear is basically could have continued the Henry Adams curve of sustained energy production. It could have made energy production very clean and would have allowed a whole host of other technological development and progress. So that case specifically halted nuclear for about 18 months. Now, some plants did proceed, starting in 1973, 1974. But yeah, and it increased the burden of all those plants. And the thing is about nuclear, of course, is that there's always some community nervousness about nuclear, right? So the communities always have concerns when they're putting a nuclear power plant in their area, because maybe they don't understand it very well, or there's just they've seen some horror movie or something like that. Nuclear power plants, of course, are very safe in the U.S. especially, but what NEPA does is it gives them a handle to sort of drag out the decision to fight it, to fight it in court, to raise the cost of the applicant and so on. And then the applicant, responds by either, mothballing the plant, which has happened in a few cases, or by just pouring more and more resources into this environmental review process that by the time they get going with construction, it's been years, and time is money, so the plant ends up, not very profitable because of all of the sort of you're extending the timeline over which the investor can get their return, right? And so it just really discourages new investment in nuclear, I think, as well. Yeah, we discussed that on a previous episode with Jay Storrs Hall, and that was also how he explained that afterwards, well, it would have enabled lots of other technological development, so that really slowed us down in many ways by missing out on nuclear. And we also discussed that nuclear is very safe, very clean, and very efficient, obviously. So we really missed the boat there. Where does it bring us now to? Where are the low-hanging fruits now in terms of unlocking economic or technological progress and development?
Yeah, so speaking of energy, like one area that I'm really excited for and interested in is geothermal energy. So for most of, for the last 100 years or more, we've used geothermal energy to make electricity, but it's been at places where it's very obvious at the surface, right, that there's some geothermal activity going on, right? So the first geothermal plant was at the site in Italy. It's called the Valley of the Devil, because there's boiling water that comes straight out of the ground, right? And so pretty obvious that there's steam there. You can run a turbine off of that steam and produce electricity. And it's been going since, I think, 1906 or something like that. Now, and that's basically, what has happened, what has continued to this day, kind of the biggest geothermal field in the world is a site in California called the Geysers, which is not really geysers, it's fumaroles, right? It is volcanic activity there. Iceland, some in Hawaii, a few other, a bunch of other places, New Zealand. So again, like near volcanoes, basically, or other sort of very obvious high temperature resources near the surface. And those sites are not everywhere. Obviously, the projects are all bespoke, custom projects, and sort of you haven't had to develop the technology to be able to expand where you could do it. So coming out of the oil and gas, the shale fields in the U.S., the oil and gas industry's like massive growth actually in the last 15 years in the U.S. Like we've really perfected a bunch of subsurface engineering techniques, especially fracking, right? And what this enables is, in principle, you could do geothermal anywhere, right? You drill basically like start from a place where there's no obvious heat at the surface. If you drill deep enough, you will eventually get to heat, right? So the simplest way to conceive of this, I think, is you drill two wells. You drill one that you're going to inject water in and one that you're going to produce steam out of. And then, just conceive of it as just like you're drilling straight down. And then you frack between them, create a fracture network between them so that you put water in your injection well. It traverses the sort of the hot rock through all the cracks that you've just created by fracking. And so all that surface area allows the rock to transfer heat to the water. It becomes, super hot, super, pressurized steam. And then it comes out the production well, and then you can use that to drive a turbine. And so, again, in principle, we could do this literally anywhere on the planet if we could drill deeply enough. And there's just a ton of this energy, right? It's if you look at sort of the scientific estimates of like how much heat there is in the Earth's crust, it's like 40 times more than all the nuclear energy that we have on the planet, and, including seawater uranium, which is like by far the biggest source of uranium. So it's just a tremendous amount of heat, of a heat resource, an energy resource. And so sort of figuring out how to do this to, sort of in a repeatable fashion, you just that will enable you to like drive the cost of this down. And I think, get to a point where we have almost unlimited baseload power. It is different from other renewables in that you can run it 24 hours a day if you want to, right? You can also do some load following as well. So you can sort of have it output more certain times a day or less other times a day.
What's holding it back?
Well, I think some of it is just technology development, right? So and sort of like industry awareness. So this is going to really take off if it takes off because the oil industry sort of transitions to it, right? It's the same skills that, we use for oil and gas drilling and fracking, like are going to be applied to geothermal. Obviously there will be like minor differences, right? In terms of, what depths you're targeting and, what kinds of fracking you're doing. It actually is a little different. But it's by and large the same skill. So part of it is just we need to get people out in the field trying it and trying new methods. And I think once a few people start to succeed, I think that will pull more people in, and they'll go there'll be a sort of a flywheel effect as like, oh, this works, and we know how to do this, and so on. And that will, I think sort of learning by doing is going to drive the cost of this way down. But a couple other things, I think it would be really nice to have new drilling tech, right? So mechanical drills break. When they break, it is the deeper you are when it breaks, the more expensive it is to stop drilling and pull the string all the way out of the hole and then fix it and then send it all the way back down, right? So it's actually more important the deeper you go that you have durable drilling equipment. So there's a company called Quaise that, full disclosure, I invested in It's spun out of MIT, and they're developing millimeter wave drilling capabilities for the really deep sections, right? For the granite sections, and basically they can use energy to vaporize granite, and the hole has a lot of really nice properties. They create a melt liner and so on that actually strengthens the hole relative to the surrounding rock, and make sure that it's not porous, and make sure that it has high integrity and so on. And then I think that the other piece that's maybe holding the industry back a little bit is a permitting issue, right? It is NEPA related, which is that a lot of the shallowest resources, including the shallowest resources that are not like obviously volcanoes, they're still in the US, they're tied to federal land. So there's a tremendous overlap because most of the shallow heat resources are in the western half of the United States. The federal government owns a tremendous amount of the West, and so that means you need a permit to drill. Now, the oil and gas industry had this figured out in 2005. They got a law passed that says, basically your oil and gas well is categorically excluded from NEPA, and so basically it takes you about 2 weeks to get permission to drill an oil and gas well on federal land, whereas it takes you about 2 years to drill same hole, same drilling rig, etc. It takes you much longer to drill a hole for geothermal energy. And so, kind of my policy solution there is, hey, if we do this for oil and gas, we should do the same thing for geothermal. So, I think that has been pretty well received by the administration, and so I'm pretty hopeful that in the next year or so we'll start to see movement on that.
So you're working towards making that permitting process easier right now?
Exactly. Yeah, I think that, it should be very similar to the oil and gas one, right? That you should be able to go through what's called the categorical exclusion to NEPA. And just so provided that site has been studied before and so on, it's for leasing or whatever, then you should be able to quickly just
I mean, the problem with nuclear energy is that it has a bad rep and brand, right? So what chances would you give, or do you expect nuclear has a chance of a revival or coming back?
I think that the biggest problem with nuclear is kind of the same problem that sort of the old version of geothermal had. Everything was incredibly bespoke and custom. Everything is, in sort of the modern nuclear industry in the U.S., every reactor, every plant is unique. And then we never got to the point of we're going to have one plant design and we're just going to make a sort of a cookie cutter version of that plant design everywhere. If we kind of figured out how to do, we're going to have one of these and we're going to do 100 of them, one design, and we're going to do 100 or 200 or 1,000, right? Like if you did that, that's how you drive the cost of nuclear down, right? The problem with doing every plant bespoke is that you drive up the cost, and then the energy actually from nuclear is not that cheap. Like that's the thing, is that from existing plants is not that cheap, right? And so So what you need is some sort of repeatable process for driving down the cost, and that's hard to do. It's been hard to do. The NRC has not always been the most cooperative agency, but ultimately I do think it's part of the blame lies with the NRC, but part of it lies with the industry for not making better decisions, right, about the kinds of plants that they're going to deploy. And so I think that the biggest opportunity for nuclear in the sort of medium term is much smaller plants. Sometimes people talk about small modular. I'm not even sure that some of those smaller modular reactors are small enough. Like smaller the better, because you get approval for one, and then there'll be demand for like many, many more, right? So it could be even targeting the diesel generator market, right? Mm-hmm. Where there's thousands of I don't know how many, maybe millions of diesel generators in the United States. What if you could replace every diesel generator in the country with a tiny nuclear reactor? Then you're turning these out by the thousands, and that is what's going to drive the cost down.
Yeah, a bit more of a sort of mainstream narrative, not the one that we're obviously the discourse that we're in, is that, hey, we need to grow less, right? Because we're pumping less bad stuff into the air. B, we need to replace our fossil fuel-based sources of energy with wind and solar. And C, we need battery storage to make it all work and to make it able to power electric cars. What would you respond to someone who has that narrative or that story?
Well, I think there's a lot in there that I can work with, right? That I'm happy to go along with. I disagree with the conclusion of degrowth, right? Like I want to grow faster, but I think electric cars, to take a starting point, are great, right? They're better than fossil cars. They, you don't have to change the oil. You don't have to have problems with your spark plugs. There's fewer moving parts in general. So like maintenance is easier. The acceleration is better. The fuel is cheaper, right? Like you can charge up at home and it's more convenient. You only have to fill up outside of your home, like when you're on long road trips, right? Like like for most people, like, unless you go on a long road trip, maybe like once or twice a year, you never have to fill up outside the home. So it's just a better product, right? And so that's great. I think that I do take environmental considerations seriously. So I think one thing I'm really excited for, in addition to the climate benefits of electric vehicles, is the reduction of particulate matter and sort of the air pollution. There is a really convincing in aggregate literature on the negative effects of air pollution. You see it in all kinds of things. You see chess grandmasters perform worse when it's a particularly smoggy day than, and you see things like when they took away, when they introduced Easy Pass on the New Jersey Turnpike, you had a reduction in premature births, right? Because of the sort of the reduction in sort of diesel engines idling on the parkway. So it's just, so I'm really excited for that. I think that is a completely legitimate form of progress that I want to see. So where do the challenges come in? I think like one challenge is, how do we produce enough batteries, right? I think that the battery industry is going to grow so fast over the next 20 years. They're going to double and double and double and double, and it still won't be enough. I think our demand for batteries is going to be insatiable for the foreseeable future. I would take issue, of course, with the idea that wind and solar are the only forms of electricity that we should have. Of course, we should have wind and solar, but we should also have nuclear and geothermal and maybe some other forms as well. Solar is going to be, I think, very, very cheap in the future, right? If it, particularly if we can keep sort of the cost of panels coming down. I think there's valid disagreement about like how cheap they'll get. Some people I think are too optimistic, but they're cheap, right? Like you said, like they would need storage, and I think there's going to always be scarcity of storage because we're going to want the batteries for cars and not for solar storage, right? So that's a challenge. I think the other thing I would say is that for those of us who care about sort of material progress and industrial progress, I think that the climate movement is actually kind of aligned, right? And one thing that I've found is that when I talk to people, it's like, yeah, we need to build like a ton of clean energy. If the more they care about the climate, the more they agree with me, right? So I think that what's interesting is that we're starting to see a little bit of a split in the environmental movement between the climate activists who completely recognize the need to build, at least wind and solar, if not also geothermal and nuclear. And they also see a need to build new transmission and to build new forms of transportation and so on. And that is very aligned with my view that we need to be able to build stuff in this country, including a lot of physical world infrastructure that that is blocked by things like, local vetocracy and regulations that are hard to deal with. And so I see a ton of alignment for those of us who are technological progressives in terms of dealing with climate. And of course, like, the only way we're going to solve climate is by advancing technology. And so I think I always try to work with people, when they express strong environmental views. That I kind of, I agree on a lot of things, and I think that there's a lot of natural alignment that's been overlooked for a long time.
Yeah. Also, wind and solar is also facing some of the same problems that other technologies are facing, right? I just know it from some anecdotal evidence, but solar has a big permitting issue, right? If you want to put a solar cell on your rooftop and onto the grid in Germany, there is a very bureaucratic permitting process, which is sometimes very costly for small households. Similarly, in Africa, it's very hard to build sort of solar and wind farms on a scale that are necessary because of it's extremely hard to do business anyway to get permits, right? It often takes years and it's just prohibitively expensive. And then you need to, especially what you want to work in multiple jurisdictions.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's all true, and I've heard mostly about sort of like the U.S. experience with grid scale solar, let's say, right? It takes actually a lot of land. You need to have a lot of land to do a big solar power plant. And, a lot of times that might be federal land, right? NEPA, guess what? You're there. Or you need some other federal permit or to, connect to transmission or whatever. And there's going to be NEPA there too, right? And the NEPA review covers not just the connection to the transmission, which is what you're trying to get approval for. It covers the building of the plant to begin with. So you've got to deal with like all this like land use requirements, and then there's conservation groups, right? The other half of the environmental movement that is, I think they care about climate, but that's not where their focus is. It's more on biodiversity and sort of conserving the habitats and species that we have now, and they're like, well, we want clean energy, but we don't want you to take up this much land for it, right? And like this land is a habitat for some species that happens to live there, or sometimes it's even like a plant, a fern, a rare fern is there, and like this will ruin the habitat for that species, and so I think again, there's like a ton of alignment, and as you say, it's like a lot of permitting issues.
Yeah. The other, like, we met at an event by the Foresight Institute a week ago, and that's also another point you can bring in the debate, why we need technological progress to fix the climate. You talked about geoengineering, right, as a potential solution that would also require a lot of progress.
Yeah. So, so my high level view on geoengineering is that we have a ton of options. We have like sort of an embarrassment of riches in terms of all the different things that we could do in principle to, either cool the planet directly or to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, or to do some other form of, ecosystem management or ecosystem engineering to either cope with the effects of climate change or directly offset them or whatever. And so there's just so many opportunities, but I think there is this question of like, well, who is allowed to do this? And like, if you tried to, do a bunch of iron seeding or whatever, would you get, would you get hauled into court or arrested or, being told to do some permitting first, et cetera. So yeah, I believe like on a technological level, like we have most of the tools we need to deal with the climate issue, but it's the social layer and the coordination that's much harder to deal with.
Yeah, it's like at the beginning, when I wanted to start my career, was also very interested in energy. I was initially on the economics and policy side. And what deterred me from it, what I think can also be deterring for many other people who want to make an impact in energy and in climate, well, it's just the sheer amount of politics you have to deal with, how many people you need to convince. That plus on top, it's a very capital intensive industry. Capital intensive industries are generally harder to enter for outsiders, right? Because you just have to raise much more money to get even started, right? So you have to work a lot with the entrenched interests to get that kind of money to get anything started. Are there any opening that you see or any advice you could give to young entrepreneurs who hear what we're saying and who want to, help fix the climate?
Yeah, I think that one piece of advice would just be embrace the hardness of the problem, right? So I actually think that sort of these physical. So I think a lot of people are tempted to go into software, right, or to go into machine learning or something. Like there's no regulation. There's tons of advances. You can make money very quickly, and those are all good things. But I actually really like the physical world industries because it's a ton of capital. You have to do a ton of raising, but like it's cool to be like a titan of industry, right? Like that's kind of fun. The regulatory problems are significant, but they're actually really fun to work on, right? I think. So dealing with that challenge is, you have to approach it with the right mindset. And then the third thing is that, like, if you go into software, it's like you can have like some app or something and somebody can copy you right away, and like you lose out, because you were like the second best company to do some pretty easy thing. So you have no moat, right? Like you do this like kind of easy thing, and somebody else does it slightly better than you, and they become a billionaire, and you're like still poor and eating ramen. And with sort of the more hard tech industries, like nobody else is going to be crazy enough to do what you're doing, and so just do the hard thing, and sort of embrace the challenge of it, and you'll have a built-in moat because nobody else is going to be crazy enough to do it.
Love it. Please talk a bit more about why or in what ways it's fun to deal with the regulatory challenges.
I think it's like a strategy problem, right? It's like you're trying to figure out what you can get out of it. It is not purely like a zero sum thing, right? You do develop relationships with the people that you're working with and so on. But it's just fun. I think it's like a fun mode of problem solving, of like, how do I get this rule to be changed? And like, here are the different resources at my disposal, and like, here are the different potential levers that I could act with, and so on. And you develop a strategy and you execute it, and it's interesting, right? I think it's interesting in a way that merely like trying to get some code to compile isn't.
Yeah, for sure. You learn a lot about human nature.
Yes,
about
exactly.
Politics and everything. But how can you get started at solving these regulatory challenges when you start out? Is there like a lobby group or a caucus or an organization that you can go to that helps you overcome some of these things?
I think that doesn't really exist in most industries. I mean, there's industry associations, right? But they're usually geared towards helping the incumbents, not necessarily helping the new entrants. So you kind of
you have to be the outsider, right?
You have to be an outsider, right? And so I mean, you might want to join. You may or may not want to join the incumbent industry association if you're a startup. But yeah, I think that it, sort of the initial phase of your company, usually you're trying to meet your technical milestones still, right? And so sort of the regulatory burden, it does ramp up kind of slowly, right? You don't have to deal with it usually on day one, and you don't have to figure out how to get licensed or something like that, right? You're building your technical milestones and sort of gradually adding on the more and more sophisticated regulatory capability.
Great. To shift gears a bit about a different topic, I think that was a really amazing tour de France into the world of energy. Um, why is air travel not getting any faster? You already talked about it in the beginning. You work with Boom, but why is it not getting any faster?
Yeah, I think that, the biggest obstacle in the industry, the near term obstacle that I was working on was landing and takeoff noise. But I think the biggest obstacle in terms of market size and in terms of, enabling the industry to really flourish is the overland ban over the United States and most countries, right? So in 1973, the United States put in a supersonic ban, a speed limit. Basically, no civil aircraft could fly faster than Mach 1. And they did that, for a number of reasons. One is because there's a legitimate issue of sonic boom. The sonic booms can be loud, particularly if you have a Concorde type aircraft that has no boom reduction sort of aerodynamics built in. And then also, I think it was partially for mercantilist reasons, right? Like the U.S. had a supersonic program through about 1971, and then it was canceled, and they were like, well, we can't let Europe just like take this whole market, and so we're going to make sure that it's illegal for them to fly, between, from New York to LA, let's say, on a European airplane. So I think is combination of both. Probably either one could have been sufficient for the overland ban to happen. But in any case, it happened. And I think, sort of the paper that I wrote with Sam Hammond in 2016 is we argued, look, this ban, what it really does is it cuts off the natural entry point into the market. The natural entry point into the market is a small, say 6-passenger private jet, right? It's smaller, so it has a lower boom. And then also like the owner of the private jet doesn't care that much about efficiency. Cause they're rich and they're not very price sensitive in terms of fuel consumption and so on. And so that is the market where this should have gotten started. Now, the problem is that private jets fly about 75% of their miles over land, not over the water. And you effectively made that impossible with this, you're not going to buy one private jet for 25% of your miles and then another private jet for 75% of your miles. And so it just doesn't work anymore to have a supersonic private jet, which means that the entry point has to be an airliner, which means that it has to be, you've got to be building basically for the transoceanic market. So you can have, I think with airliners, it's about 50% miles flown over the ocean versus 50% over land, but they can be different planes, right? So you could have a plane that specializes in transoceanic flight. It's still not clear that that's big enough, right? So the issue with the supersonic market is that there's still debates over how big is the market for that kind of plane. So say like a boom style plane, right? And when I was there, I think we argued like, oh, there's a market for 2,000 of these, just factoring in over water routes. And then you get different sets of assumptions, including some that are maybe more realistic, and they push the market size down to 500 or lower. And then it starts getting to the point where, well, is it really worth the engine developer's time to put resources into developing an engine for a plane with a market that's only a few hundred, and maybe they don't even capture that whole market. And so the sort of the scale of the market doesn't get big enough. And so my contention would be that if you got rid of the overland ban, you increase the size of the market, and you enable it for private jets as well, you'd start to see a lot more investment from the whole ecosystem, from the whole aviation ecosystem in supersonic flight, and that would sort of push us forward. If you look at, one of the things I've looked at is, what is the speed of transoceanic travel, commercial transoceanic travel, and it started in the 1930s. I forget how many miles per hour it was going, and then we got the sort of the first high altitude airplanes, then we got the first jets, and then we got the Concorde, and it's sort of increasing, not quite exponentially, maybe even kind of like linearly. But if you just kept that trend going to today, we'd be flying at Mach 4, right? Which is, four to five times faster than we're going today, or about 5 times faster than we're going today. And, it would take you, between New York and London in under 2 hours, right? And then if you allow that, over the United States, you could get between New York and LA in like 90 minutes or something like that. And that's where we should be. And instead, we're actually flying slower today in most cases than we were in 1958 when the 707 entered service across the Atlantic. So it's been not just stagnation but regression in aviation, and I think it's driven almost entirely by this ban over the United States, where instead there should be a noise standard, right? There should be a rule that says, okay, you can only make a sonic boom so loud. The rule could be, one number during the day and a different number at night, right? When you may have to be quieter at night to fly supersonic, fine, but there should be at least some number you could, in theory, hit and do that.
Yeah. I'm wondering, because people made that rule back then about the speed limit instead of the noise level, and they were probably not thinking or knowing about these unintended consequences that followed, right? So maybe there's also unintended consequences when you regulate for the level of noise, right?
Well, I think it's definitely true. I think it wasn't that they weren't thinking about it; it was that they made an error in judgment. Right, they explicitly in the rulemaking where they introduced the supersonic ban. Remember this rule that I talked about earlier that Congress set out, that it's got to be economically reasonable and technologically practicable and appropriate for the kind of aircraft while protecting the environment. Like that existed in the 1970s, right? And so that was already in place. And what they did to justify the overland ban is they said, look, this is not going to hold back supersonic development. Even with this ban, there's still a market for more than 500 planes, right? And so we project that in fact there will be more than 500 planes, supersonic planes on the market, or in operation within some number of years, like within 10 years or something like that, right? And what we saw instead, of course, was only 14 Concords entered service. So and that's all we've seen, other than there was a Russian plane as well that saw a limited service. And so they made a huge error in sort of forecasting the market, and so it's time to correct for that.
Well, my point is that I think that the problem is with how we make decisions, right? So when we release a new software to production to the market, we get feedback from the market. It has bugs, right? So we are tracking it, fixing it, and then re-releasing it. Like we have a new version, right? A 2.0 or 3.0. Right, and in software development in other industries that goes faster. When it comes to regulation, which is also kind of a product, like we want to optimize for safety and efficiency in the best case, that's just not the case, right? Mm-hmm. So I talked about this in another episode with John Chisholm, with something like sunset clauses. Hey, what if this regulation lasts only for like 10 years, and afterwards you have to do like an impact review of something, where you have to assess what did actually happen, and then you can either confirm it or you can adapt it, right?
Yeah, I think that there's validity to that. I think the problem is that almost every regulation is in place because of some real concern, right? And it's not a fake made up issue in most cases. And the real harm from regulations does not come from any one rule. It comes from their totality, right? It comes from, it's not the one pebble in the stream. It's the giant pile of pebbles in the stream that creates a dam. And so what we actually have to do is to be willing to say, well, there are valid concerns that people have that we are going to choose not to address in regulation. And that is extremely hard for government institutions to commit to. right? Yeah, especially if, it's incredibly hard for, say, politicians, right? The bosses of the bureaucrats, for the politicians to commit to. Like there could be, if there's a plane crash, there's no politician who's out there saying, well, the optimal number of plane crashes is greater than zero, and this sort of lax level of regulation has allowed the industry to flourish and driven costs of transportation down, and that benefit outweighs the cost of an occasional accident. They don't say that, right? And so I think it's really hard to get to a state where we sort of pre-commit. We are not going to solve every problem with regulation.
Yeah, and that's, I think, where the innovation needs to happen in the mode how we make decisions, right? So, how does this process look like, right? I mean, if we're able to get to a point where these decisions get made with more like feedback from the market, where we can fix errors more easily, right? So, I think that's something. But to shift gears a little bit to a couple of more not rapid fire questions, but just about a couple of other issues I was curious about.
Sure.
What's your bet with Robin Hanson about colonizing Mars?
Oh, let's see. A few years ago, Robin was soliciting, views on, when will we get to Mars, right? When will we do it? Will we get there by 2030, and specifically? And so I was not at the time. I kind of took seriously the idea that Starship, which is what the big mega rocket that SpaceX has under development. It's rapidly reusable. It's refuelable on orbit and stuff. Like, it is a Mars rocket. And I was like, okay, I think maybe a 40% chance that we can get. That there will be a human standing on Mars by, I ended up looking at like when the launch windows are, right? And I think there's one in 2029 that would put a human, standing on Mars by, I think I added a little bit of buffer, but I said, by end of Q1 2030, I think that a rocket, or I think that a human could be standing on Mars. And Robin gave me 2-to-1 odds, which I wouldn't have taken it at even odds, but I took it at 2-to-1 odds. And so I'm not super confident that will be hit. But I think that we will see the first orbital launch of Starship here in the next 6 months. And then, you've got to get it qualified for humans, and you got to, prove that you can do the refueling. And there's a lot that needs to happen. But in principle, there could be a cargo mission that launches in 2026 to Mars and drops off some supplies for the first settlers, and then a little over 26 months later, maybe they would launch humans.
What's your case for Ethereum maximalism? Does it still hold up?
Yeah. So I do think it still holds up. Sort of my view is that basically anything you can do with Bitcoin, you can do with Ethereum, but not vice versa, right? So Ethereum is better in a bunch of important senses than Bitcoin is. In particular, if what you care about is like a fixed money supply, well, you can do that on Ethereum today with just having some token. I could issue 21 million Eli coins and implement a smart contract that guarantees that there will never be more than 21 million Eli coins, and we have a fixed monetary supply, and I can do that right now. What matters is how useful the base layer is that you're transacting on. And I think, Ethereum has this view that there's a lot of progress still to be made, and there's a lot of development still to happen. Whereas the Bitcoin community has taken the view that, layer one is close to frozen. We're not going to really make any major changes and so on. And man, I just think we're in such early days of crypto. I think there's a lot of development still to happen. So the Ethereum community more aligns with that value of mine. And so I just think that there's a ton more opportunity to do things on Ethereum versus Bitcoin. So the title was of that piece was a little tongue in cheek. I was just kind of trying to rib a few people. But yeah, so I do, but I am big fan of the Ethereum ecosystem and love the emphasis on, sort of developing the technology while also trying to maintain credible neutrality, which is kind of what I think is important. I'm not as interested as some people are in the monetary piece of it, or of having a coin that is independent from sort of central banks or whatever. I think that I think that's incredibly important for if you live in Argentina or Brazil or in a bunch of other countries. That's incredibly important. Not so much for people who live, say, in the U.S.
Right. Is the United States overall still a great place to innovate?
That's a great question. So, what's interesting is yes, it is still the best place to innovate, I think, on a lot of dimensions, maybe not all of them. But in terms of, certainly in terms of, rule of law still works. It's pretty reliable. If you write a contract, it will be enforced. That's phenomenal. That is we should not take that for granted. That is not the case in a lot of the world. Concentration of talent, right? Huge market, right? That you can, so if your product gets approved in the US, you have 300 something million rich people to sell to. Which again, not the case in most markets. Just in physical security, right? This has become sadly relevant with the events in Ukraine, right? But nobody is going to invade the U.S. You could not, literally could not do it. There's nobody that could do it. So physical security. I think that the U.S. has so many advantages in many aspects of the global economy that the paradox is that it has not always had to be a well-governed country to function. And so there's a lot of things that are, sort of our institutions are kind of crappy. Permitting being one example, but you could say zoning or a lot of local government is just abysmal in quality. But yeah, it still has so many advantages that certainly I think a lot of people should still consider moving to the U.S. if they want to do something ambitious.
Yeah. So any alternative options or exit options from the United States that you think are underrated or interesting to propel some of these innovations that we were talking about, like nuclear energy or geothermal or whatever?
I am all for people doing regulatory arbitrage when they can find an arbitrage that works. The challenge is, especially in the hard tech industries that I follow most closely, you really do need a big market, right? So it's not a question of, can I get some tiny jurisdiction somewhere to approve me to operate? It's how can I scale to a massive market as quickly as possible, right? And if that's your question, exit becomes really hard. You need, I think it would be great to convince India to make some to engage in some regulatory arbitrages. And I love the idea of the smaller scale regulatory arbitrages where you can do it, but it simply, I think, does not work for a lot of hard tech. I think there's some testing related stuff, right? If you want to test drones or something like that, I know there's a project in the US to use an Indian reservation to be to create a financial zone, right? And I don't know if that legally checks out. I don't know if that's going to work, but where you can take advantage of an arbitrage, absolutely, people should do it. It's just that if what you need to succeed is not just regulatory arbitrage for development, but for deployment, right? If you need to be able to deploy in a big market to be able to ever be profitable, it's really hard to take advantage of those arbitrages.
Yeah. I mean, I see the case for sort of being a launch pad or a greenfield, right? So many entrepreneurs in some of these fields, nuclear energy or drones, they already need to talk to multiple jurisdictions to get more shots on goal, to get approval, right? So, Google Master from Last Energy was talking about getting approved in Romania, Poland, or the UK, right? So, and I see many of these kinds of entrepreneurs. So, but there's like this chicken and egg problem. They, these regulators haven't seen it before. They want to have data. They want to see that you already have capital, right? But to attract that capital and to provide that data that's safe that others are using, I think some of these special jurisdictions could be sort of used as a launchpad, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. Then the other thing to keep in mind is in aerospace and nuclear, both of those industries have export controls, right? So the challenge is like in aerospace, a lot of things that look like a rocket engine or an advanced supersonic engine look also like an ICBM motor or a cruise missile motor, right? And if you so a lot of these propulsion technologies in aerospace are closely controlled, especially the high speed ones. And so, the U.S. is not going to let you export that technology around the world without, they're saying it's okay. And the same thing is true with nuclear. Anytime you're doing anything with like highly enriched uranium, you're going to have a hard time. So yeah, I think that there is certainly scope, as you said, like for as a launch pad or developing proofs of concept and stuff. But you just got to stay out of these industries where there's export controls.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Sometimes when I hear this or when we're discussing this, I find it I get a bit sad, right? Because in the end, there's all these barriers, right, between different markets and jurisdictions. And, it's very rare that we can reduce these barriers, right? I mean, within Europe, we got more or less open borders and free trade, which is great. And just an example of how it can work, within the United States with different states. But overall, right now, it seems to me that there's there is a risk that countries and jurisdictions are becoming becoming less open, right?
Yeah, I think it's definitely happening, actually. I think, sort of one way to view sort of the last 100 years is the U.S. basically bribed everyone to join their alliance against the Soviets, right? So if you certainly like you can think about like the opening with China in the 1970s, right? Richard Nixon goes to China and opens up. It's like, okay, we're bribing you to like not side with the Soviets, and so we're going to be friends and we're going to trade with you and so on. And that's gone, right? The Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union collapsed. And so the sort of like the argument that it's not the only argument, but it's the one that the U.S. was actually using to justify that relationship with China. That whole basis is gone, right? And so what there was some overhang, and we had a rapid growth in China because of the trade that the U.S. was willing to do with it, and trade is mutually beneficial, and I'm all for free trade. But I think in terms of like the justification that the government sort of internal to the U.S. was doing for it, it kind of evaporated, and so I worry, I fear that we are moving to a more siloed world where there's not a single global market. We're moving further away from a single global market in a lot of dimensions.
Yeah, so my hope is really instead of the decentralizing pressure of a lot of what's happening in the world of blockchain, for example, which showed really the possibility that, hey, it just takes a technology, and especially in that case, it grew an industry to a scale where it had to educate millions of people in the arguments why it's better to have decentralized money, right? So I'm kind of hoping that can make a lot of people think how to decentralize other things as well, and kind of build industries around it that have their own vested interests in building alternatives and doing it better, right? And that's kind of my hope to make things more open in the end.
Yeah, and like, to be clear, like I love that idea, and was very, certainly like very enamored with it. It kind of part of my dissertation was written on like sort of like centralized versus decentralized technologies, and it, I think that my only caveat is, it depends on which industry. It's very fact specific in terms of when it works, when it doesn't. And I think like where I would disagree with someone like, say, like Balaji Srinivasan, who I'd consider a friend, is, I think that while doing these sort of decentralizing experiments, like it's not realistic to think that the US is going to evaporate or, go away, and that everything would be fine if it did, right? I think actually so many, still even to this day, so many public goods provided by the US specifically for the rest of the world, it would be very hard to imagine a world where that all goes away. Like one very minor example, not even like a large piece of it. It would be like the global positioning system, right? Like the GPS satellites. Without no US, no GPS.
Sorry.
No, if there's no US, there's no GPS, like on your phone, right? And that's not even the biggest public good that the US is providing for the rest of the world.
Yeah, but I mean, what I like is, even though is to that Balaji helps us start thinking, and I think in many ways he raises some interesting frontiers where we can apply the same logic. One interesting one is decentralized science, for example, right? So science funding is very centralized, and now there's a movement with DAOs that's using crypto money to fund longevity research, which is something that's hard to get funding for because aging is not considered a disease. And there is other ways to think about solving or fixing some of these things through decentralizing technology or pressure, and just replace the existing public goods that the United States or other countries provide with better alternatives without hurting anyone in the process, right? Because you can start these experiments on a small scale, right? And you can have them through voluntary opt-in.
Yeah, and so I'm 100% on board with that. But I would also say, like, in some ways it's too literal, right? Like you could have decentralized funding even within the US. Like, just like get if you could take like half of the NIH's budget and split it into two NIHs, right? That would be like more decentralized, and that would be good. That would be a huge win, actually, because any one institution is going to get captured, right? And so have like take the budget and just like split it in half and have one agency that like continues being the NIH, and then another agency that does something like a little bit different. I think even that kind of decentralization
but
has
still,
value.
I mean, what you need to do is, I think in many ways, reducing the barriers to entry, right? And the barrier to entry, or to get that force pressure on the NIH or another like public agency, is just much higher that you need, right? So when you have lower barriers to entry, you can just have a much higher number of young entrepreneurs just try out something different, right?
Yes.
When 100 people or 1,000 people try, one of them is going to be like Vitalik Buterin Ethereum, and
Sure. Yeah. No, I completely agree. Right. So all these are just like, all my points are just like caveats on your points.
Yeah. But I also ultimately agree that it would be a mistake to underestimate the power and the stickiness, and also the achievements of what the United States is doing in terms of providing public goods, in terms of providing a good commercial and legal basis for international trade, right?
Yes.
And the ecosystem it built for innovation inside the country that is reverberating in the rest of the world, right? Silicon Valley and everything that's built. So,
yeah, it would be great if more countries would try to actually compete seriously with that. I think it would be awesome.
Exactly. I mean, if Europe could catch up to the standards in the United States when it comes to many things, such as incorporating a business or doing like a VC fund, which is what I'm doing, it's just still much, much easier, like 5 times easier and less costly and less bureaucratic than in Europe. So
yeah, totally.
Fantastic. Anything else that we haven't talked about yet that you'd love to talk about?
Oh, I don't know. Let's see. I think, so just when we're talking here, it's sort of the over the last week, people have been really excited about AI, right? And so people are really thrilled with the sort of the progress with Chat GPT specifically, and all the exciting progress there, which I do think is progress, but I think people overrate how much that's going to solve a lot of economic problems, particularly. So I think so. What I'd suggest ending with is just like a bit of realism about how much can we innovate if we have unlimited. If we say we have unlimited content because these generative AIs are producing tons of content. Well, content isn't that scarce. Yeah. And we still don't have a problem. We don't have a solution for NEPA, and we don't have a solution for the NRC, and you don't have it doesn't help with clean energy deployment and getting stuff through the FDA regulatory process. So how do we I think there's a lot of people who want to be optimistic about stuff, and there is genuine exciting progress in AI, but my take is just be a little more circumspect about what will this actually do in the world.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I'm kind of used to really not jumping on any public hype about any kind of technology, because that's extremely rarely, if any time, really where the changes happen, at least the ones that are interesting for me as a VC, right? It's almost always the ones that are happening on the margin with people that have a very different kind of outside view and not the thing that's in everyone's shopping window right now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so Eli, it was absolutely epic to do this tour de France through technology, innovation, and regulation, collect so many of your learnings on how to do regulatory hacking and help unleash a new wave of technological progress. Eli, anything else that you would like to draw attention to? Who are you looking to collaborate with? What do you need right now? How can people find you if they want to reach out to you?
Yeah, great. So let's see. You can find me online a bunch of places. So my main home is the Center for Growth and Opportunity, which is a research center at Utah State University. So we're at the cgo.org. And, I have great colleagues there who are also working on sort of this idea of abundance and how do we drive that forward. And you can, probably the easiest way to follow my work is just follow me on Twitter. I'm just Eli Dourado on Twitter, one word. So, look forward to staying in touch with a lot of your listeners.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Eli, for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
Fantastic. Stay on for a second so it can